Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another conversation. This week I'm with Professor David Flint, who I'm really excited to have a discussion about. Now, Professor, there's a lot of different ways I thought I could introduce you to this, but your credentials are as long as my arm. The best way I can say it to my own audience, who perhaps haven't heard of you, is I can't think of anyone that I've interviewed in the past that's more knowledgeable on the Constitution, on economics, on international law, on politics, especially calling elections and calling out voter fraud where it's happened in countries around the world. So I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with you. But more notably, some people may have heard of you as the professor that, emeritus professor that announced that nominated Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. And I think a lot of people would certainly clap to that in my audience. But I wanted to welcome you to the show, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we end up having.
Well, Joel, I'm delighted to be here and very happy to answer your questions.
Awesome. Well, the reason we've been meaning to have this discussion for a very long time, and we've been talking for maybe 6 months back and forth. Now, just so you guys know in the background, the reason why it's taken me so long, it's not that I don't like Professor Flint. I wanted to interview him 6 months ago, but I had trouble finding a lot of locations to film out east here, near Bondi. So I wanted to say thank you to the lovely lady and her husband who actually built this home, not just for the conversation, but it's actually on the market, and they don't know I'm giving them this shout out. They just offered this space for a film. But this is 2 Park Parade, Pagewood in Sydney. I had a look around before I got started, and it's an amazing house, really nice finishes. This isn't a paid promotion. I just want to really thank them for allowing us to have the space to actually have this discussion without traveling 25 kilometers to see each other. So thank you guys so much. And 2 Park Parade, Pagewood in Sydney. Check it out if you're in the market for a property. I think it's a 5 or 6 bedroom house, very nice finishes. So Professor Flint, we've just finished the federal election. There's been a lot of, this wasn't a typical election, I felt. And I just wanted to get your general feel on a number of topics that relate to this election. This conversation will be covering what happened in the US election 2020 with the presidential election where there was a lot of fraud. We're also going to talk about exactly how the Australian election went, not only the trends that we saw in where the electorate's at, but also looking at exactly where there were election fraud in this particular election. And also I want to have a look at where we go from here. Do you see the Republican versus monarchy debate coming up? And what are the general trends happening in society? So first off, I thought it'd be appropriate to talk about this particular election. We saw a situation where there was a resounding rejection of the Scott Morrison government, and we saw a movement away from conservative values, which is what won him the prime ministership last time in 2019. What's your take? What are your big takeaways from this particular election?
Well, it is a very unusual election, but what I think it shows is a feeling among the people that they are very much tired of the captured two-party system. And we do have a two-party system which is no longer parties controlled by the members of the party. If you go back to 1949, at the time of the great Liberal victory under Sir Robert Menzies, the Liberal Party was a mass political party and controlled by the members of that party. And the same would be true of the Labour Party. What we've seen is a gradual diminution in the number of party members, but we've also seen the emergence of professional politicians. These are politicians who don't go into politics after they've been successful in something else, which was the great tradition in our system and in Britain and other countries. What you're seeing more and more are professional politicians. We're seeing pre-selections very much controlled by power brokers, and we're seeing candidates chosen not on the basis of merit. We're seeing candidates, and this is on both sides, candidates chosen for their loyalty to a particular power broker. This is the corruption of the political system. The Westminster system was never intended to work like that. The system of responsible government, which the British gave us only soon after they discovered it, in the middle of the 19th century, which essentially means that governments are formed, they're responsible to the lower house, the House of Commons, the House of Representatives, and that house is elected by the people, and that it functions to a great extent with an enormous amount of freedom for those members at the lower house. You still see it in London at Westminster, where, for example, question time is not choreographed. At Canberra, question time is fourth-rate theatre. It's all choreographed in advance. Unlike the situation still in London, the Speaker doesn't look around and decide which person should ask a question, and there are many people standing to ask a question. In Canberra, the Speaker is instructed. He has a sheet of paper prepared by the whips. And as we know, the questions on the part of government MPs are written in the Minister's office. The Minister then thanks them for the question which was given without notice, which is that is a complete lie. The question is with notice. And the Minister answers that question, and the opposition tries to catch up the government with the questions they ask, but it is not the question time which was devised at Westminster. And the lower house functions that way, and it's not so surprising that we have an increasingly large crossbench, because people are very much dissatisfied with the two major parties. We have a government which has come to power with less than 32% of the vote.
Yeah, it's laughable.
And 600,000 less votes than they got in the election they lost in 2019.
Yeah.
We have a government which has fewer votes than the opposition. It's got several 100,000 more. So we have a very strange situation. We're told repeatedly that our system of elections, which is probably the most complicated, the ballot papers, the most complicated, probably in the Western world, among comparable countries. And as I've told you before, I believe it's a system more open to fraud than most other comparable countries.
Really?
And I think that there was a survey done on this very question.
No way.
By Dr. John Lott of a centre in the United States which aims to prevent this sort of thing. And it's very easy to work this out. If you look at most comparable countries, almost all require some system of ID. You have to identify yourself. And one country that doesn't actually sends out a barcode to each elector, and they have to bring the barcode with them so that it is then read. So that's the way they do it. The one other country that doesn't have some system of ID is the United Kingdom, but they're gradually bringing it in. They brought it in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, because of the problems there, and they're gradually bringing it into the United Kingdom. And it is so elementary. The reason why it's elementary is that any system where fraud is an advantage, usually with money, for example, credit cards, always has preventions, systems to prevent fraud. In Australia, we are told a fallacy, and those who are telling it must know it's a fallacy, that there's not much fraud in Australia. And there's more fraud even than we assume. We know that about 20,000 people, over 20,000 people voted more than once in the 2019 election. There have been no prosecutions in relation to that. And that is the reduced figure after the AEC has used every explanation, one assumes, to understand other people appearing to have voted more than once. And that's not the only, that is marginal in relation to a greater outlet in relation to fraud, which I'm happy to talk about.
I want to bring it back to the fraud in a second. A lot of people listening right now to me are probably saying, Joel, see, there is a lot of fraud that's going on. But a lot of them don't understand the fraud that you're calling out specifically. The course of the last week, there's been a lot of people in what I call the freedom movement, a lot of from these 10 or so freedom parties, and they've been making the point that there's been a lot of ballots which have been taken home from AEC workers, that there's been a lot of obviously malfeasance from the AEC workers giving out wrong information about how to fill in the Senate ballot for independents, and essentially writing off the entire election by saying it's completely voter fraud. And I've been taking a lot of time to specifically and systematically go through each example of that. I think we'd both agree that the AEC giving incorrect information out to workers, out to voters, above the line voting for the Senate for independent candidates, that's wrong. They need to give accurate information about voting above the line.
If I may interrupt you, do you think it's so complicated that the AEC officials,
Exactly.
who are casuals quite often, that they themselves don't understand it? I mean, I have to reread it every time
Yeah, absolutely.
to work out what one is supposed to do. Now, a friend of mine who's well educated, when he looked at, he was getting a postal ballot because he was sick at the time. And when he looked at it, he said, what on earth do I do with this? Particularly when he saw the Senate ticket. But even the House ticket was bad enough because he had to be reminded that he had to fill in all of the preferences and not miss one. And he said, but I don't want to vote for these people.
Yeah. But one of the things I really recognise about your criticism is it's like a sniper. You say, this is the problem, this is how it's come about, and this is how we can solve it. I'm concerned about, at least my own audience, that there's a lot of people that are saying the whole thing's rigged. And when you ask for examples of how it's rigged, often it's very difficult to find significant amounts enough to flip the entire election.
I agree, that was the problem in the United States.
Yeah, and then they didn't vote in Georgia.
Yes.
That was my concern. They had the 2020 election, which we can talk about, and we called out at the time. We said exactly how it was rigged in a bunch of different ways, besides the fact that the entire media establishment stacked against was Donald Trump. But my big concern was then that people thought that their vote didn't matter at all, and so they didn't show up, and then they lost the Senate in the Georgia runoff election in December, I believe it was. And so it's certainly in all of our interest to understand to what extent is there fraud, how can we fix it. The majority of criticism, in at least my comment section, it has either been about writs, it's been about ballots going missing, it's been about incorrect information from the AEC, but it hasn't been about the things that we can actually address with policy, like better voter ID, so people aren't voting multiple times, like you said before, 20,000. And so that's why I really wanted to have this conversation, so we could talk back and forth about what it is and how we can solve it.
Would you like me to run briefly through the loopholes, the entries?
Please, all of them would be great. Wow.
Well, let's start out at registration. To enrol, you have to register to enrol. And that's all very well during the ordinary part of the year. And you're required to provide the number of your license, you're required to, or alternatively of your passport, or have somebody identify you, and you do that in front of another elector. And that's all very well. I don't know to what extent those are actually checked. But the serious loophole, which was created essentially by the High Court invalidating legislation that John Howard brought in to stop this week where there was a vast amount of enrolments. What happens is that when the Prime Minister decides upon an election, he advises the Governor-General, and if the Governor-General agrees, which he normally would, the election is announced. And then there is a week during which the rolls remain open, and people can enrol during that week. John Howard, realizing that this was the big fraudulent entry, because there was a vast tsunami enrolments
right.
during that week.
Yeah.
He introduced legislation. And that legislation took effect. It was strongly opposed by Labour. It took effect, and it lasted until the 2010 election. In the 2010 election, as the election was approaching, Get Up produced two plaintiffs in the High Court. One was a person who hadn't bothered to register, so he was in breach of the law. He hadn't enrolled. The second was a person who hadn't advised the Electoral Commission of a change of address. He hadn't bothered to do that. Both were in breach of the law. Normally, courts are reluctant to bend over backwards for people in breach of the law, but the High Court rushed the hearing of the case. The case was heard urgently. A decision was handed down by the court. We didn't know how the judges voted on that decision. We didn't know their reasons. But before the election, the High Court declared that the closing of the rolls on the day the election was called was in breach of the Constitution, and that the legislation John Howard brought in was constitutionally invalid.
Wow. Wow.
Consequently, a large number of people enrolled, and Get Up claimed that they got 100,000 extra people onto the rolls.
Right.
The Australian Electoral Commission does not have the resources to check those. They are accepted at face value. So it's quite possible that people in this place, people could use this address knowing that it's for sale. They could use this address. You could have 20 people. And in previous times when the control of the roll was much more rigorous and the political parties could engage in controlling the roll by going around and checking addresses, sometimes they'd go to an address and they'd ring the doorbell and they'd speak to the person who answered and said, just checking the roll, and they'd read out a list of people who are living there, and the people who are actually living there will say, well, I've never heard of them.
Right.
We don't have 10 people living here.
Yeah.
Never heard of those other 8. There are only 2 people living here.
Right.
And there were lots of cases like that. There was a case in Queensland where instead of the envelopes being, these are posted envelopes being sent to electors, were being sent out, instead of them being done by the post office, they'd been handed over to a independent driver who came back and said, well, on that long avenue, a very long avenue along the side of the island, I had to deliver envelopes from the Electoral Commission on both sides of the street.
Right.
But one side of the street were all the rocks and the surf and the ocean. There were only people on one side of the street, so I delivered them, but I couldn't deliver the others. And there were a vast number of votes. And they'd registered people on both sides of a street, whereas there was only one side of the street. And if you allow that sort of thing, naturally it's going to happen. People are going to take advantage of it. If your credit card could be accessible to other people, of course they take advantage of it and use, if you were careless with the number on your credit card and so on, they would use that. The system that we have doesn't control the vast number of votes, the vast number of enrolments which go in. I think there are about 700,000 between the calling of the election this time and the closing of the rolls. I have no doubt that many of them were fraudulent. Now, during the same-sex plebiscite, the same-sex plebiscite was a postal plebiscite, and it was conducted by the Bureau of Statistics, but they got the information, the rolls, from the Electoral College, the Electoral Commission. Now, they received 250,000, about 250,000, 250,000 returned to senders.
Right.
I looked at some research in America about the percentage of mail that didn't get through, which actually ends up being marked and sent back to the post office as returned to sender. It was 4 or 5 times, they thought, having done some tests. I don't know what it is in Australia, no one does, but I know in the block of units where I live, a large amount of mail is left on top of the letterbox because tenants have changed. People don't bother marking letters RTS and sending them back to the post office.
Yeah.
But the Bureau of Statistics got 250,000. And I suspect, I'm sure, that they would have asked the Electoral Commission what to do with them. I don't know what the Electoral Commission said, but the fact is that the Bureau of Statistics destroyed all of those return to senders. They should have been given to the electoral commission, so they could have marked off those names which were returned to sender.
Yeah.
Some of them legitimate, people had moved and so on. Some may not have existed. I suspect a considerable number may not have been real addresses. Now, 250,000. And the Electoral Commission, apparently, they didn't protest after it was announced publicly that these had been destroyed. But this is shocking. That meant that those names stayed on the roll for the next election, which was the 2019 election.
Yeah.
So I assume, and we don't know how many there are, but I am sure that there's such an attraction to do this, that there are large numbers of people on the roll who do not exist. They're made up. It's very easy to do this. Between the calling of the election and the closing of the rolls, you have a week, and you just fill out a form. It's not going to be checked, so that the number given there for the license number, for being a driver, could well be just made up.
Right. Yeah.
And the person signing as an elector, witnessing all this, may not exist.
Right.
Now, the way to correct this is to insist on some more formality. I mean, even when I pick up a registered parcel from the post office, I have to show my identity, and an independent person, the postmaster, postmistress, has to actually see that.
Yeah.
There should be some more formality, and in most countries there is more formality in relation to enrolment. It has to be done to somebody like a JP, for example. So that would be one way of dealing with that. But the other thing is the actual voting. Because when you go in to vote, you are asked your name and address, and you give that. But that is not in any way supported by evidence. You're not required to produce something, as you are in most countries.
Yeah.
In most European countries, you have to produce this. And the argument presented when Mr. Morrison introduced legislation, only because one nation insisted, when he introduced legislation far too late in his term to ever get it through. It was last October. And there was then an inquiry, and Labor strongly objected because the indigenous people, it was claimed, would be disadvantaged. Now that was a ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous argument, insulting to the indigenous people. Indigenous people drive. They have access to bank accounts. They have access to Medicards and all sorts of things like that. There are many things which could be used to identify them. They're no different from the rest of Australians. To suggest that they would be disadvantaged is insulting to the indigenous people. And that wasn't a genuine argument. Now, we need to control in a much more proper way, as in other countries, the act of enrolment. Yeah. The same applies in relation to actually casting your vote. Until the 80s, you were required to vote in your subdivision. So I knew where I was supposed to vote. It was a school in Bondi. And so the number of people they would see would be smaller than the whole electorate. Now in my electorate, I can vote in almost 40 places. The extraordinary thing is that there's no computer link. It would be so easy to have a computer link so that when my name is crossed off the roll, it's crossed off all over the world.
Yeah.
In London, in New York, and other places where people vote, in every polling station,
Yeah.
in my electorate and all over Australia. And why isn't it? They sometimes talk about cost. Governments, extraordinarily, both sides,
Yeah.
throw vast amounts of money down the drain.
Yeah, you'd think that of all things they'd want to secure the vote.
Yes, so that is ridiculous.
It's so easy.
And one sometimes suspects that this is deliberate. Because what other conclusion can you possibly come to?
Yeah.
So it would be reasonable to require identification. It obviously, that polling station should be linked with every other, so that if I try to vote again in another polling station, they would say, well, look, you've already voted. We'll allow you to make a declaration vote where it's put in an envelope and can be checked later. Possibly, for example, the act of declaring your identity could be videoed. They could have video cameras. We have them in department stores and all sorts of places, banks and so on. Why couldn't there be a video of the act of actually declaring that?
Yeah. Yeah.
There are ways to discourage fraud. Instead of discouraging fraud, fraud is encouraged.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me so angry because there's so many problems to solve, but obviously we're not really sure exactly how to solve them.
I don't know how much fraud there is, but I think it must be substantial. During the referendum, I was involved in the Republic referendum. We asked a man who was really celebrated at the time in relation to being expert on elections, Malcolm McKerris. And I asked him whether there would be fraud in the election, and if there were, in the referendum, and if there were, would it be substantial? He said, I'm sure there will be fraud, but I think that the result will be so strong that it won't really matter. It will affect it, but it won't change it.
Yeah.
And in a situation where you have a landslide, it's likely that fraud may not have affected that significantly.
Yeah.
But where you have an election which is close, and what would be closer than this election?
Yeah.
The government yet hasn't been able to produce a majority. It probably will.
Yeah.
But we're still waiting on, we'll be waiting for weeks, perhaps months on the Senate.
Yes.
But we're still waiting on the House.
Yes.
And this is because of this ridiculously complicated system, which is not superior to the Anglo-American system, which is first past the post. People say, oh, well, that means that you get in because you can get in because you don't have a plurality. You don't have 50% of the vote. Mr. Albanese doesn't have 50% of the vote. All he has is 32% of the vote.
Yeah.
And he's Prime Minister, he's in office.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this system, which is complicated because it's going to be fairer, we're told, is not fairer, and it's unnecessarily complicated, and it discourages people who are not interested in politics, who are new to the country and are surprised by the complexity of voting, or who are elderly and find it very difficult and complicated to deal with. Just the size of the Senate paper is difficult to deal with in the small polling booth.
Yeah, it's amazing because it could have been a lot longer, couldn't it? If they got, with the legislation they brought out, because of the Liberal Democrat Party, they wiped out a lot of these sort of Senate candidates as well.
Yes, the size of the parties, they have a minimum size for the parties.
Yeah. So what do you do in that situation? I mean, I've spent the last 2 years telling people that your vote still counts. There was a lot of voter fraud that happened this election, but people aren't saying what you're saying. They're not at all. They're saying that they're getting still caught. I'm still trying to explain to people what the two-party preferred count is on election night. A lot of them, they thought it was voter fraud. They thought that the chief officer at the centre was getting the call and saying, no, don't worry about number 1 and 2 on the ballot. Just go to the major parties, these two candidates that we put forward. And I had to explain that to a lot of people. That's what they're getting caught up about. Stuff that is like it's all documented.
Yes, and that is
in the
predictive. The commissioner is predicting the result.
Exactly.
He's not changing it.
Exactly.
He's predicting it.
Yeah.
I don't think that's unreasonable given the complexity of the system, but it shouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
We should have a system like the United Kingdom, like the United States, they both have their own weaknesses. The other things which I think are wrong are those that go against the very idea of an election. The whole idea of an election, and I think this would have been in the minds of the founders who wrote the Constitution, is that the election is a snapshot. It's like taking a shot of us. It freezes things in time.
Yeah.
It means that everybody has heard the same arguments. They haven't prematurely gone to vote before everything is heard. The costings come out very late.
Yeah.
The launches are very late. And many people have already voted. I think the idea of long pre-polling is undemocratic and possibly unconstitutional, depending upon what the High Court thinks.
Right.
And the other thing is that the practice of postal voting is not policed. You can tick any of those boxes and you're not required to give any proof
Yeah, well, I mean,
those are applicable.
I mean, what did we see this time? I think it was some of the One Nation people that actually blew the whistle on this. The major parties, with their typical campaigning mail that they send out, they were also attaching to it QR codes, which would allow you to go to one of their websites, the Liberal Party or the Labor Party's website, and sign up to get a postal vote there. But what they were finding was, so this is for New South Wales, this is for Maurice Payne. This one was done properly in that the return to sender, the return address was actually an official address for the AEC. That's fine. But the Queensland one, for the Labor Party, it was going via Labor HQ. And it's like, why are you looking at my details? Are you going to use it for a campaign? Are you going to change my vote? I mean, there were a lot of concerns about that this election. And I think this is the first election they've pulled something like this. I'm very worried about that particular stuff.
Well,
but
it's wrong. You're absolutely right. The parties should not be involved in postal voting. The other thing about postal voting is that we do not know that it's secret, particularly if it's done, for example, in an aged care home.
Yeah.
And the people being supervised, and somebody is doing the voting for them, for all we know. And that is a situation which gets away from the idea that all voting should be secret. Postal polling should be tolerated in exceptional circumstances, and they should be demonstrated. I'm not at all interested in, whether I'm interested or not is another thing. I don't think pre-polling should be encouraged. There should be sufficient people on the counters in the polling stations. Polling should be simplified so that if we must have preferential, it should be optional. You should be allowed to give your preference if you want to, if we must have it. But I think, why can't we do what the British and the Americans do, and most countries do, just have first past the post?
Right. Wouldn't you worry though that the problem you have is the argument of splitting the vote. See, at least right now, the way we have it is we have one of the most robust preferencing systems in the world, in that if your first person doesn't get in, your second person might have a chance. And so what we saw this election was that, especially with the Senate ballot, it's looking like the Freedom parties will probably get up for a minimum 4 senators up around the country because of we don't have the first past the post system. We have a preferential voting system. So they were able to combine their votes together in order to actually get up. Whereas I feel like a first past the post system would favour the establishment even more. Don't get me wrong, it's complicated, the preferential voting system, and we always try to educate the populace, even though they forget it from the last election. But I can't help but feel that it would help to, I mean, let's take Nigel Farage, for example. He managed to get Brexit relatively done. He probably would have liked it a bit better, but he was never able to get anyone up in UKIP or in the Brexit Party in the UK Parliament. But he did in the European Parliament, and he was able to accomplish his goals because of the press that came with that and the pressure and his show on LBC. But the UK Parliament completely shut off to a third force coming up on the Conservative side, because I think if they had the preferential voting system, maybe they could have actually done that. But I don't know, I feel like there's trade-offs for everything.
Whatever the voting system, it's going to advantage some parties and disadvantage others. And this will vary from time to time. For example, the preferential system worked very much in favour of the coalition when the Labour Party split into two parties.
Right.
And the Democratic Labour Party gave their preferences to the coalition, and that kept Menzies in power longer than he normally would have been in power. But the preferential system was brought in by a Conservative party in Australia because there were two Conservative parties and they were competing with one another. They were putting up candidates in different seats. They had no agreement that they would not compete against one another. So it can advantage either party. Any system will advantage either party. And you're right, in the UK it disadvantaged Mr Farage's party, but there would be times when it could advantage his party. You can't devise a system which always helps you. Yeah. When they brought in preferential proportional representation in the Senate, that was brought in by Labour, and the Labour minister who brought it in said, we'll always control the Senate. Very soon after that, the Labour Party split and they lost control of the Senate.
Yeah.
So you cannot guarantee that a system will always help one party. Systems do work sometimes for one party, sometimes for the other. I don't know whether you should be allowed to have effectively more than one vote.
Right.
Why should I, for example, be able to vote as I did for one party, knowing that eventually my vote would end up in a certain party's place? Yeah. So that I did it to demonstrate to a principal party that I was unhappy, as many people were, but I wanted to make sure that that party got in. Well, I didn't. Yeah. I wasn't successful in that.
Well, maybe we both agree that on a state level, at least in New South Wales, every state has different rules. That having voluntary preferential voting and being able to cut that off at any point might actually be a more favourable way to do it. Because if you like the second guy more than all the other candidates, maybe he should get your preference. But if you want to cut it off there, like we do in the state elections, then maybe that should be an option. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, I think optional preferential voting is a reasonable compromise. Right. I think these things should be, if not in the Constitution, they should not be easy to change. They're too easy to change by a party which has control of both houses.
Yeah, which we might have now.
Yes.
Except the balance of power in the Senate is from the Greens and potentially David Pocock of the... well, I'm really worried about where things go, especially with the upcoming state elections, because we're kind of dealing with different beasts. It's so refreshing. I feel so at home having a conversation with you, because I don't have to explain any concepts. If anything, you're explaining concepts to me. With the state of Victoria, I've talked to MPs down there on a state level, and they've said that the voter fraud down there is much worse than on a federal level. And you've just outlined how bad it is already with the AEC. Where do you see some of the biggest holes in Victoria's electoral
Well, I'm no better informed about Victoria than the rest of the Commonwealth.
Right.
But Victoria does seem to be a state which is different from the other states. I remember during the referendum, Victoria was, if we were going to lose a state, we thought that Victoria would be the first to go. So we changed our method of campaigning, and we did this on the advice of a very clever man, Rick Brown, who was recommended by Nick Minchin. Rick Brown was very close to B.A. Santa Maria, who was probably the man who in many ways was behind or involved in the split in the Labour Party, the anti-communist part of the Labour Party, taking it away from the left wing of the Labour Party in Victoria, which was very far to the left. Some said communist in many ways. But Victoria is different in that it seems to go to more extremes than other states. I don't know whether the system is that much different from ours, but all of Australia has a system of not requiring adequate identification, making it far too easy to register, and allowing for a period during which fraudulent enrolments are easy to make. I think we all have that, and I think all of that should be discouraged. I would think that some of the reforms of the Constitution should extend to making sure of integrity in elections, state and federal. I think that would be an important change in the Constitution.
Do you think that we could see a situation where Dan Andrews is returned as the leader in Victoria?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Right.
Not at all.
I think federally the Liberal Party is certainly having a lot of thoughts about their direction. Where did they go wrong? I'm a bit worried because we're seeing, okay, great, we've seen the more conservative leader, Peter Dutton, get up. I think it's undeniable that probably Josh Frydenberg would have become the leader if he didn't lose his seat in Kooyong to one of the Teal independents. But the fact that the Liberal Party is now going through this post-mortem after a massive election loss, I mean, losing these inner city Liberal places that had been Liberal for like 100 years or something, those places are now in a situation where the politics has completely shifted on its head. These independents will not be easy to get rid of. Where does the Liberal Party go from here? A lot of people in the Liberal Party are saying, oh, it means we have to move more left on policies, it means we didn't say enough on climate change. And you know, like, I mean, I'll just throw it out there. Where do they go from here?
I think the West Australian election demonstrated that if a Liberal Party goes to the left, it disappears. and that's what's happening in Victoria.
Yeah.
And we saw this with what they did to Bernie Finn.
Yes.
Who's a member of Parliament. I think he was at some time the party whip. And he made comments, quite legitimate comments. I'm not saying they were correct, but they were certainly legitimate. And he made comments about the American Supreme Court and the likelihood of the Supreme Court reversing the decision in Roe v. Wade. Now, Roe v. Wade, as no doubt your viewers know, is the case in which the Supreme Court found that there was a constitutional guarantee of the right of abortion. You'd have to turn the Constitution inside out to find that. It doesn't exist. They read it into the Constitution on the basis of, one judge famously said, the Constitution is what we say the Constitution means.
Pursue life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I mean, I don't understand how you turn life into death.
Yes.
That's just wild.
Now, Bernie Finn said he favoured that decision, and he also favoured, in Australia, laws not encouraging abortion, but restricting it. He has been expelled for that from the parliamentary party, for saying something which is usually treated as a conscience vote in both parties.
Yeah.
And for saying this, he is expelled from the parliamentary party. Now, that suggests to me that this is not a serious party, that the leaders of that party are not going to stand up to Dan Andrews, and in many ways they supported much of what he did.
Yeah.
One of the great cases of maladministration in Australia was during the COVID crisis, when they dispensed with what was the normal rule, even in colonial times, that significant regulations would be brought before the Executive Council, with the governor presiding, and that the documentation would be presented to the governor with a supporting case for some major change in the regulations. this would be a very formal act. And also that either house, particularly the Legislative Council or the Senate, would have the power to disallow that regulation. Most of this has been swept away, whittled away over the years. And we saw, in relation to the pandemic, that governments were acting like dictators, particularly the Andrews government and the West Australian government, but even in New South Wales, we had a situation where the Premier seemed to decide that she would close down the building industry, and we had the Chief Medical Officer saying, well, I didn't recommend that. But we suddenly had the appropriate minister in his office signing a significant change to the regulations, not going to the Executive Council, not being tabled in each house, and the houses not having the power to disallow.
Yeah.
Now, this is what happens in a parliamentary democracy, but we behaved in many ways like an authoritarian regime, and we were copying. I didn't agree with statewide lockdowns. Yet we had statewide lockdowns, and that was copying the zero COVID policy of the Chinese Communist Party, which was the organization which in its laboratory in Wuhan created the virus. It is generally believed that this was manipulated by mixing different viruses, and that it escaped from Wuhan. Some people say they let it go deliberately, others say it escaped, but we do know that for a significant period of time, while people were returning from the New Year celebrations in China around the world, the communist government did not advise other governments, did not advise the World Health Organization, that there were large numbers of people, possibly with the virus, spreading it around the world.
Yeah.
This was an act, a delinquent act, by what I fear is a delinquent government in Beijing.
Yeah, and as a result, we saw other countries around the world adopt that same policy of locking down zero COVID.
Yes.
Yeah.
Until then, the policy in relation to a pandemic, people say we had no pandemics since the Spanish flu. We did have. We had other pandemics. Tony Abbott wrote the policy for which he received international praise when he was Minister of Health. And the policy until COVID was that you deal with, you protect the vulnerable, the elderly and those with other sicknesses. In this case, they would be protected. The rest of the country would be advised what to do, for example, not to go to functions where there was no ventilation, large numbers of people, and just to be careful, but let them get on with their lives, let business continue. But we adopted the lockdown from Beijing. And the state which did it more than anywhere else in the Western world was Victoria. But because of an incompetent, inadequate opposition, it is likely that Mr. Andrews is going to be victorious in the next election. We saw what they've done in relation to Bernie Finn.
Yeah.
And they do not seem to be a serious opposition like the West Australian opposition, which was more green than the Greens.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you tell the Victorians for their election in 5 or so months? You know, if your opposition, major party opposition, Liberal Party, is nowhere to be found, if Dan Andrews says we need a snap lockdown for 2 weeks, and the Liberal Party say we can do better than that, we'll only do 1 week, and the populace doesn't want a lockdown, who do they back? I mean, do they back some of these minor parties, many of which do not have their organisation together? Or do they just try and reform the Liberal Party? Do they just tap out of politics? I mean, a lot of people are perplexed by this.
I think you have to join parties, whether they be the existing parties. In some parties it's difficult to have any impact because the rules are so arranged that you can't have an impact. In New South Wales, for example, it took a long time for what they call plebiscites. Plebiscites are just pre-selections by the members who live in that area. But we saw these suspended for this election so that a triumvirate, influenced strongly by the Prime Minister and Mr. Hawke, decided on pre-selections.
Yeah.
And foisted those, keeping allies in certain seats and putting others into other seats. Little wonder that they lost those seats.
Yeah, what was it, 12 out of the 13
Yes.
pre-selected seats where they had did captain's picks,
Yes.
they lost.
Now, there are new parties. I was surprised that the UAP, spending so much money on advertising, didn't present a program. They had their launch very late. It was, they had to pay for it to be shown on television. I watched it. But there wasn't a total program. I would have thought that a new party with that enormous advertising budget would have had a total program. They would have been saying, we are going to do this. We are going to be serious about defence. Defence is an area which is absolutely essential to this country. But both major parties have failed in the area of defence. We had, for example, with the Liberal government, this ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous position in relation to submarines, of getting the French to convert nuclear submarines into conventional submarines,
Diesel,
to be delivered in 20 or 25 years. What do you say to Beijing? Please don't do anything for 25 years because we won't have our submarines until then. Having submarines is very important because it gives you, particularly nuclear submarines, but you want them this year. Having them means that you have what few countries have. You have that capacity to deliver a second strike. You can deliver missiles to your enemy, and they're very difficult to detect. So you have this marvellous thing. The AUKUS agreement, which I would think that Peter Dutton was a significant person advising that, as I'm sure he was a significant person in getting rid of the French submarines. No criticism of the French. They didn't dream up this mad idea. It's as mad as Snowy 2. These silly ideas that the Turnbull government turned out, spending billions of dollars, a complete waste, and they would never achieve what you need. But what we need in relation to defence is we need these things now. We need missiles, we need drones, we need the sort of things which are working to an extent in the Ukraine, and we need to be as self-sufficient in relation to defence as we possibly can be. We need to be like Israel in that regard, and we're not. We've wasted an enormous amount of money, and I don't have great confidence in the new government in this field. But we also need to develop this country. We have an immigration system, massive immigration system, but what we're doing to the unfortunate immigrants is effectively saying, well, you've only got 3 places to go to. You can go to Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane and make them even more crowded than they already are. In Sydney, we're living on top of one another on the most sparsely developed, populated continent in the world. We could develop this whole country. There's one thing you need for development, and that's water. We have more water in this country, particularly in the last few months, but normally we still have a lot of water in this country. It just needs to be moved around, and we've had plans which go back to the 20s, the Bradfield Plan. We have the Beale Plan in relation to northern New South Wales. We have the Bridges Plan in Western Australia. There are wonderful plans. It's just a matter of moving water around, which even Libya was able to do, but we're not doing it. Without that, we can't develop the country. And we can't really effectively deliver to immigrants what they need so that they don't all become Uber drivers or working in coffee bars, so that there's real work. And we need, obviously, a manufacturing industry in Australia. But if we're going to be obsessed with the untruth that politicians can control the climate, none of those politicians, particularly the teal ones, even if they were in government, they can't control the climate. Even if the theory, the increasingly discredited theory of significant man-made global warming is true, and it is increasingly discredited. Even if it were true, because of the tiny emissions we produce and the massive emissions which countries which will never agree to zero net emissions are producing, our politicians can't affect the climate. So I think we need governments being truthful. What we do need are people going into politics who are leaders. I was looking at a booklet given to cadets from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. And they say that there are many traits of being a leader, including courage, persuading people to follow you. But the greatest trait of leadership, they say, is not having any self-interest, not wanting advantage from being the leader. And how many of those who are in politics today are there for anything but their own personal self-interest? And that's because the system is so corrupted. The two parties are captured, and too many, not all of them, there are some outstanding ones, but most of the candidates are put there because of loyalty, allegiance to a power broker, and they've gone straight from the university, where they've been working probably in an office of a politician or somebody like that, union, and they have determined that this will be a professional career. You can't have professional politicians.
Yeah. What happens that, what do you do? I mean, basically, the system just plots on along, keeps getting worse, not serving the people's needs. It's conducted more and more in an American fashion on politics and personalities, rather than governing in the way that George Washington would. You get people that are self-interested and climbing up the greasy pole. What do you do? I mean, does it just keep plodding along until disaster, and then we reset, Venezuela style, we reset, and then we have to build this back up just like the founding fathers did in the USA? I mean, what do you
do? The difference, the successful countries in the world, there was a study done by Akemoglu and Robinson from MIT a few years ago. It's why countries fail. So the easy thing to look up, if anybody's interested, is why do countries fail, or why countries fail. And they said it's not race, it's not the race of the population, it's not even the resources of the country, because you can be a very wealthy country, enormous resources. Venezuela is a classical example, and you can be a basket case. At the time of federation, the two richest countries in the world on a per capita basis were Australia and Argentina. Argentina didn't have the same institutions as Australia. Argentina now has less than 1/2 of the per capita GDP of Australia. At times it seemed to be moving into the third world. And why does that happen? It's the institutions that you have. We had very solid institutions, but institutions can be captured, and that's what's happened in Australia. Our political institutions have been captured by the two-party system, not because it's a two-party system, but both parties have been captured by power brokers. And we've had the situation, I mean, we saw it, for example, in relation to graves in New South Wales last year. The government suddenly announced that they were going to take over all graves which are run essentially by the religious institutions. The Catholic Church acts as a trustee for the other religions in some regard. They thought that the graves could be taken over, vested in, I'm sure this is what they were up to. It would be vested in some commission. The graves would be privatised. The prices of graves would go up because they'd effectively be run by a private corporation. And some power broker who handled that sale would get an enormous commission for doing that. That's what I think they had in mind. I don't want to defame anybody, and I don't think I am because I'm not naming anybody. There's one thing they didn't bank on. They thought that the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, who's a gentle man, he seems very proper. They thought he was a pushover, and he wasn't. He stood up to them. Massive advertising began that the churches would take action about this, that would become a big political issue. The government retreated. They realised that Archbishop Fisher wasn't a pushover, that he was a man of steel on this,
right,
and he would protect the graves. And I think it was an example of what's happening in politics, how privatisation is being used to assist power brokers and allowing things which shouldn't be, because they're monopolies, they shouldn't be in the private sector. We should never have handed over power stations. We see this controversy now with AGL, where a billionaire has decided that he's going to close coal-fired power stations.
Yep.
That shouldn't be a private decision.
Right.
That should be a community decision, because we need, if we're not going to have nuclear, we're not going to have gas, we're going to only have renewables, and you can't have a system which only depends on renewables. You have to have those suppliers which guarantees that the power will always be there and the price will be low.
Yeah.
We've lost that. We're losing that.
Sounds like a bit of a bleak picture, doesn't it, Professor?
It is a bleak picture, but not as bleak as 1939 in the United Kingdom, when Chamberlain, having made the mistake at Munich, and Chamberlain is much criticised, but he made one mistake in thinking that Hitler could be believed, but he didn't let it happen again, because he, with the French Prime Minister, guaranteed Poland. They gave Poland a guarantee that if they were invaded, the British and French would come to their aid. That was an extraordinary thing to do, but Chamberlain was obviously not the man to lead, and Churchill came forward, and Churchill provided the leadership that the Dominions, Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, supported Britain, as did India. India didn't have much choice, but you had enormous support. And it looked very bleak. It looked bleaker than today, but eventually right triumphed. Look at the situation in the United States. I think the Obama administration, Obama came in, first black American, or half black American, because he was half white, came in as president, and that seemed to be a wonderful moment to many people, because it seemed to symbolize that what the wrongs which were done with slavery were now behind them. But the administration failed in so many things, particularly internationally. They failed in relation to the Crimea. They let Russia take the Crimea. They failed in relation to the South China Sea. They accepted the promise of the communists that they wouldn't militarize the islands, the artificial islands, which they then did. But the extraordinary failure was in relation to Tehran. They financed Tehran.
Yeah.
They effectively authorized Tehran to produce nuclear weapons and gave them the money to produce missiles.
Yeah.
A regime which was calling death to America.
Yep.
I think the Obama administration was a terrible failure. And suddenly Trump appeared.
Yeah.
And Trump, people criticized him strongly, but he drew lines in the sand which you must not cross. To the Russians, to the communists in Beijing, to the North Koreans, and even to the mullahs in Tehran. They knew where not to go. Even in relation to Afghanistan, they knew what not to do. Everybody understood there was a line. They didn't know what he would do, but they knew they mustn't cross that. He made America energy independent, which it hadn't been. Yeah. He brought back industry. He stood up, as no previous president had done, to the rorts that Beijing was pulling. When Clinton allowed Beijing to join the World Trade Organization, to get all the benefits of being a law-abiding player in relation to international trade, and then broke all the rules and stole intellectual property, each American president said, oh, this is dreadful, but did nothing about it. Instead of, you would have thought that Clinton would have said, well, we expect you, because we think you're going to become more democratic. We will check every year that you've improved the situation, that you've stopped persecuting the Uyghurs and so on, and the Christians. We will want in return for this performance. That's what a sensible president would have done, I would have thought. But they didn't. Until Trump came, and Trump drew these lines, told foreign governments what they had to do, told the Germans not to be stupid and become energy dependent on Russia and put sanctions on that, and told the Europeans, increase your defense spending because we're not going to have you as free riders on the United States of America. All of these were very sensible decisions. And sometimes a Churchill, sometimes a Trump comes along and provides that leadership.
So, I mean, in that particular election in the USA, that was interesting. There were a lot of things that were thrown around regarding electoral fraud, which was interesting. I never got to the bottom of the Dominion voting systems aspect. I think Dr. Stephen Shaviro had to look into it. But the universal mail-in balloting situation, where ballots were sent out by the state around the Constitution, they didn't amend the Constitution. That was interesting. And then there was also obviously a lot of voter fraud in a lot of different forms. Then there was also a situation with the actual, when the Electoral College vote was being counted. I thought that was very interesting that we arrived on the same point on that, despite me having no credentials. I just sort of followed, point by point what was meant to happen. For those of you that are listening, I have no idea what I'm talking about. When the Electoral College is done, what's the magic number? Was it 256?
I've forgotten.
It's around 250. Around about 256 Electoral College votes. Each state, you get a certain amount of Electoral College votes if you win it. And the way that it ends up happening was those votes would get tallied, and each state would send electors to on January 6th to have those counts being done by the vice president. Now the problem was there were 5 or 6 states which actually sent both electors, the Republicans and the Democrats. And when they got there, and Mike Pence was meant to count them, rather than put those aside, send them back to the state legislature and actually count them, he ended up counting the Democrat ones, which gave Joe Biden the numbers that he needed. If he put them aside, then there would have been what was called a contingent election. I found out what the word was. And then that would have, because what happens if no candidate gets that 200, that magic number of, I think, 256 Electoral College votes, if they're both short, each state gets 1 vote, and it goes to a contingent election, that didn't end up happening. And so a lot of people they were calling Mike Pence a traitor. They were saying he didn't follow the Constitution. And it's really funny because you arrived to that same conclusion on those topics as well.
Yes, I did, and I think you were right, and I think Mr. Pence should have exercised his power.
Yeah.
He seemed to think that he was just there as just to behave on the advice of those who brought the votes, but he had a role to play, and the president suggested he play that role, and he decided not to. I think he made a mistake in that regard, and that there should have been a contingent election, but there wasn't. And the big problem in relation, well, there are two problems in relation to the American election apart from that. That is the degree of fraud, and that was alleged. And from what we saw, where the observers were kept out, or where the observers were told that counting was closing for the night because there'd been a water pipe had burst in one place, and therefore they couldn't continue counting in a number of key places. The observers, we would call them scrutineers, were then sent home, and then the counting started again.
Yeah.
Now that was very suspicious, and we saw film showing the scrutineers put outside behind a glass window in some places where they were papering over the window, and the scrutineers were too far away from the voting, for the counting, to actually see what was happening. Right. All of these suggested that something wrong was going on. Now, there wasn't probably sufficient evidence which you could gather together to show systemic fraud. I noticed that there's now an investigation which is, and a video has been produced by Dinesh D'Souza.
Yeah, 2,000 Mules.
Yeah. What is it called?
2,000 Mules.
It's 2,000 Mules, which gives further evidence of this. But in addition, as you rightly pointed out, there were significant breaches of the Constitution which should have stopped the election proceeding. And the case brought by Texas and 17 states to the Supreme Court demonstrated that there was that significant breach. No one has doubted that the breach wasn't there. And the breach was, the Constitution says that only a legislature of a state can change the electoral law.
That's right.
In America, the conduct of the election is decentralized to the states. I think that was one of the mistakes our founders made.
Right.
Anyway, in America, it's decentralized. And the only body with the authority to make the rules or change the rules is the legislature, which in America doesn't mean the governor, it just means the two state houses. And in a number of states, key states, which was demonstrated very clearly, if you go and look at Texas versus the United States, just Google it and read it, you'll see that there's a significant breach of the Constitution in a number of states, where the governor or an elected court or various electoral officials have by themselves changed the law and allow all systems of voting where you leave your vote in a voting box, all sorts of very strange things happened, all of which could be open to manipulation. But the very fact that this occurred should have been stopped. The Supreme Court took the decision, very curious decision, that Texas didn't have standing to complain about what was happening in other states. Texas obviously had an interest because the final conclusion was affected by the massive breaches of the Constitution in other states. I think that some of the new judges, including those nominated by President Trump, were terrified. And you had Schumer, the Democrat leader from the Senate, a few weeks before, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court and threatening the judges with a maelstrom. I've forgotten the precise words, I can't recall them, but he made a threat which threatened the lives and the future of the judges. In Australia, he would have been arrested for contempt.
Right.
But it was outrageous. And it was very clear what was happening in America, particularly in the blue states in that summer, because we had massive states of disorder. We had murders, we had riots and so on, not controlled by the state governments, on which the current president and the current vice president were silent. The current vice president was actually bailing out
That's right.
people who were on charges relating to that
Yeah.
serious breach of law and disorder. But we had a very dangerous situation in the United States. And I cannot blame the judges for thinking of their lives and those of their families in relation to what might happen if they intervene. And we've seen in this current thing, in relation to the leaked draft judgment in Roe v. Wade concerning abortion, we've seen that people have got the addresses of the judges and they've demonstrated at their houses. They are under threat. And in America, this can mean, because of the amount of guns and so on, this can mean threats to your life.
Well,
who can blame the judges? I mean, they were obviously terrified. And they may well have been worried also about the state of disorder the country would have been thrown into had they decided that the case brought by Texas was justified.
Yeah.
Judges are human too.
Yeah. So what do you do in that situation? I mean, if you're America right now and you're looking at what had transpired, we're going to see what happens in the midterm elections in November this year, not just for America and where they go, but I do believe in October this year there's also the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to be looking at who leads their country forward as well. And so
I would be more confident of the result of what happens with the Chinese Communist Party.
Indeed, right. But
they seem to almost all vote the same way.
Yeah, it does seem that way. They solved the election problem before the election. But what's going to happen, Professor Flint, in Australia, we've got these freedom parties which are getting up in the Senate. It doesn't look like it'll be enough to control the balance of power by maybe 1 or 2 seats. But they are getting a stronger foothold in the Senate, and they're keeping the Liberal Party a bit more honest, saying, hey, this is where your base actually is, and these are the policies they want for a better country and a stronger Australia. Where do you see the country going? Do you think there's still hope if over time, in another 3 years, if the Freedom Parties manage to get 6 senators up and end up having as many as the Greens, do you see the country going in a more positive direction?
The Greens will have how many? They'll have.
So this election they have 12, and it's looking like the Freedom Parties probably have, if you add Senator Gerard Rennick and Senator Antic, you've got Malcolm Roberts as well, so that's 3 they've already got. At this stage, the Freedom Parties look like they have 4 to 6 still on track for. And so we could be looking at anywhere, from 7 to 9 senators this election, and maybe they'll get another 6 next election, bringing it up to 12 next election. I'm optimistic in that I can see us making a difference in legislation, like One Nation did, in pushing for better reforms electorally, because we talked a lot about fraud. But the direction of the country is probably something a bit more I'm concerned about: defence, economics, the institutions being corrupted, the long march to the institutions, including the universities. Be honest with me, how optimistic are you about the future?
Well, I'm not. I'm more optimistic about the United States.
Right.
I expect that there will be a Republican return, at least in the House and possibly the Senate, provided that there isn't too much fraud in the midterm elections. And I would expect that either President Trump is returned, or if not, somebody of his school, like the governor of Florida. Now, I think America, I would be surprised if the majority of Americans would not want that.
Right.
Now, I hope that that occurs because we desperately need this. We are a significant country, but we are doing what we did in the 30s. We're not defending ourselves. And although the army is solid, the defence forces are solid in terms of personnel, notwithstanding the way I think in many ways the politicians undermined them after Afghanistan, particularly in relation to that report. I think we do obviously need significant weapons. But we also need more. We have a drastic failing in education. I remember I was waiting to be called to speak on 2GB, and the previous speaker was referring to a situation, and it was the interviewer, and he was telling about how a few years before he'd been speaking to the office of a Conservative Minister for Education, a Liberal coalition Minister for Education. He was complaining about a particular part of education which was having a terrible effect on children and on the standards of education. And the advisor to whom he was speaking said, look, you've got to understand this. We run the office here, we run that, but the Marxists run the Department of Education. We can't have a stand-up fight with them. Here you had the Minister's representative effectively conceding the running of the Department of Education by the Marxists, and this has led to dramatic falls in teaching standards in Australia, so much so that the standards of literacy, mathematics and science are significantly below that of many of the countries to the north, countries which never had the Gonski situation where you had to throw more money into education because otherwise standards would fall. More money was thrown in and standards fell even further. And probably the worst thing, apart from the standards in the classical areas, is that the children are not being taught to love their country and to appreciate what Australia is and to appreciate what made Australia. So we're undermining the next generation. One thing I am pleased about, though, and one thing that goes against this, is that in relation to the issue concerning whether we become a fake republic, a politicians' republic, or stay as we are, a crowned republic, that issue has absolutely no support among the young. The last real opinion poll on this by Ipsos was to the effect that, 34% of Australians expressed interest in a republic. Well, that's the vague idea of a republic. Once they see the model, about half of them say, rather keep what we've got.
Yeah, that's fine.
34% was the overall figure. The age group which has had less than that, recorded less than that, was the 18 to 24. It wasn't my age group, it was the 18 to 24. And their interest in a republic was down to 24%.
Right.
Now, they've been through a very left-wing educational system which is filling their minds with rubbish, not delivering them the standards of literacy, particularly the boys. Literacy, science and mathematics, which we should have, not the fault of the children. Cramming the curriculum with junk, and notwithstanding their obvious wish to create a republic, a politician's republic, the young have revolted against that, which I find very encouraging.
That is encouraging.
What's not encouraging is the fact that children are being so shortchanged by the politicians, by liberal politicians too, and the federal government interfering in education, which is not a federal matter. And they too have done the same with their ridiculous national curriculum, which is an embarrassment to even read. Even the latest version, which is an improvement on the previous one. The idea, for example, that every subject has to be seen through 3 facets, one of which is indigenous. Mathematics has to be seen through indigenous eyes, indigenous formulas. It's as silly as the Foreign Minister Wong's indication that she would cloak our foreign policy in the learnings of the First Nations. This is absolutely ridiculous, and Jacinta Price would demonstrate it in her column, how ridiculous it all is.
Yeah, and it's good to see that she's in the Senate. So
yes, that was a great achievement.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like good news on the Republican front.
Yes.
Not so great once you realise who's next in line for the throne, though.
There's one rider there, one important matter which should be noted, and that is the Republicans are so desperate that they changed the platform, and it was in the older platform. It's not there anymore, but it's being practiced, and that is that there be a minister for the Republic, and that his or her task is to promote the Republic. Now, this is an outrage, a constitutional outrage, to have part of the Commonwealth government whose role, according to the Constitution, is to execute and maintain the Constitution and the laws of the Commonwealth. How can you maintain the Constitution when you have a minister whose sole task is to undermine one of the institutions of the Constitution? It's one thing to have another referendum. I think they know they'd lose it. They lost it in 1999. Greg Craven was writing in The Australian the other day. He's promoting the Indigenous voice referendum, and he was saying, well, we did believe. He came to the Constitutional Convention. He was a nominated delegate. He came, everybody thought, as a constitutional monarchist, and he suddenly declared himself a Republican. But he says in his piece in The Australian, we believed that the Republic was inevitable and that the majority would be in the 80s. He said we subsequently found that we lost every state, and it certainly wasn't in the 80s. It was we were defeated in every state and in the Commonwealth. Yeah.
So perhaps our apathy is actually an excellent thing in Australia. We don't want to rock the boat too much. But it'd have to be a proper referendum. They wouldn't be able to conduct it in the same way they did the plebiscite in 2017.
Yes, it would have to be a referendum. The question, of course, would be left to them, and they try and introduce the term head of state into the referendum because they know that if you put it that way, it loads the question. We say, constitutional monarchists say, that we have an Australian as head of state, the Governor-General. Whenever the Governor-General goes on a state visit, we tell foreign governments he's the head of state. When, under the Hawke government, Sir Ninian Stephen was not to be received as head of state, mainly because of the whisperings of somebody in the Australian embassy to President Suharto, when President Suharto said, oh, we won't receive you as head of state. Sir Ninian, with the support and approval of the Hawke government, called the visit off, and the Indonesians apologised, and the following year the visit went ahead. The Governor-General, the only office of head of state is under international law. There's no office of head of state in the Constitution, although we do describe sometimes the Governor-General as head of state. In 1907, the High Court of Australia, consisting mainly of founders of Australia who had written the Constitution, unanimously held that the Governor-General is the constitutional head of the Commonwealth. But the question which will be put in this referendum will be, do you want a President of Australia as an Australian head of state. Somehow they'll slip in the words as an Australian as head of state. We will fight that, but of course we'll have the disadvantage of it being in the question. But we will fight it, as we fought the last referendum. There's no example in our history where Australians have said no and changed their mind. And sometimes in the past they've been asked 5 times.
Really?
They're not asked. I looked at these carefully. I looked at them. In most of those cases, it was about giving more power to the federal government. Since then, the High Court, in its wisdom, has effectively given those powers to the federal government. I think improperly and wrongly, but that's just my view. But there's a very strong history in Australia that once the Australian people say no, they always say no on every subsequent occasion. No guarantee that that will happen again, but it is a record I wouldn't like to be fighting against.
Yeah, interesting. It's funny, isn't it? Because the last election, 2019, people saw it as a resounding no to climate change. In this election, you see the establishment parties trying to twist what they're saying and say that, oh, this election, it was about climate change, and they actually do want climate change policies. Well, that's in fact, they're in for a rude awakening in the future.
They are.
I think.
And I think that the Australian people have been conned by the politicians and the mainstream media on this, particularly television, for example, but also the press. They haven't been strong enough. And there seems to be a belief that the politicians can change the climate. Now that is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And of course they can't. And Australians have also indicated in polling that they're concerned about climate change, but they don't want to pay any more money in that regard. And when they see the power bills, because of the excessive reliance on Chinese windmills, which are killing all those birds, Chinese solar roofs, which, when they're useless in a few years' time, will have to go somewhere, and they'll be dangerous junk, which has to be disposed of somehow, along with the windmills. There'll be a realization that perhaps that wasn't such a wise idea.
Yeah, we're learning, aren't we?
Yes.
We're a young country, but we're slowly learning. Well, Professor Flint, I want to thank you for your time. I'm hoping that everyone I think they definitely got some great takeaways on voter fraud. And I'm eager to see, we're in a bit of a movie, isn't it? It's quite amazing, the events that have happened the last 2 years. I'm excited to see how the state elections go in November for Victoria, March next year for New South Wales, and also the US election as well, to see what ends up happening.
I think the state elections will be interesting. The states have been emasculated, as you know, to a great extent, mainly by the High Court and the politicians. The whole idea of the states is that they have certain powers. We didn't put into the Constitution, as the Americans did, because nobody thought it was necessary, that those powers not granted to the Commonwealth were the states. But the High Court developed what they called the reserved powers doctrine. The High Court said, well, obviously any power not given to the Commonwealth is a power for the states. In 1919, the High Court changed that. One of the mistakes we made, it's a wonderful constitution, but they made mistakes. And one of them was that the power which appoints the judges is Canberra. Well, you're going to appoint judges who favour the increase of powers and the authority of the Commonwealth. We now have a federal government which, unlike any other federation in the world, collects 80% of the taxes. This doesn't happen in Germany, Switzerland, Canada, the United States. 80% of the taxes. Gives back about half of that to the states, because the states don't have the money to run what they've got to do, because they don't have the taxation power to do that. And the situation then is that they tell the states, we'll give you this money, but we're going to be running these things with you.
Yeah.
So they interfere in areas for which they have no competence. They can't run defence, which is their primary function, yet they try to run all sorts of state affairs with the states, telling the states what to do. We need stronger states. I think we need more states too.
Yeah. I think the idea of adding more states and more senators as well would be really good, and that might be a discussion for another time. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how we progress into the future, and how the national discussion goes with our constitution and what needs to happen. But Professor Flint, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad we could finally make this work, and I hope we get to do it again sometime soon.
It was a pleasure. Sorry to keep you so long.
No. My problem is I usually have to, it's very rare I interview someone where we're right there with it on policy. We understand each other, and we understand exactly certain democratic concepts. So this has been very refreshing for me, and I want to thank you for your time.
Pleasure.